The problem was that scale was lying to them. They didn't know it yet, not completely, but they were about to. Panther traversing. Kaplan yelled from the bow, watching through his periscope. Turret coming our way. Wainwright drew a sharp breath and nudged the elevation wheel up just a fraction. The motion was tiny, 2 millimeters of movement at the hand wheel. If that, the kind of adjustment nobody wrote about in manuals. He did it because something in his gut told him the first shot had dropped just a little too low and just a little too short. And if he tried to correct a chart, like the book said, he'd still be short. On. Firing. The second round slammed out of the gun. This time, they all watched. Through his sight, Wainwright saw the tracer streak in a shallow arc and then flatten. The round struck just at the base of the Panther's turret, where the turret ring met the hull roof. It was a freakish aim point, exactly between the heavily sloped glacis and the thick turret front. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Panther bloomed. The impact flashed bright white, a pinprick of sunlight on armor. Then a geyser of fire shot upward from the turret's ventilator, followed by a thin pencil of black smoke that thickened and billowed. The turret stopped traversing. For a breath, the German tank seemed to freeze in shock. Then the commander's hatch blew open, ejected by pressure from below, and a column of dirty flame punched out of the opening. Hit! Wainwright howled, a note of disbelief under the exultation. Cole whooped. Kaplan slammed his fist into the bow gun shield. Ortiz muttered a curse in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Harris's heart hammered against his ribs. Target destroyed. Gunner, shift right, look for more cats. Nobody get cocky. They'd just done what every intelligence report said was extremely unlikely. A front aspect kill on a Panther at 600 meters from a Sherman 75. According to the official story, that wasn't how this battle worked. But Kursk didn't care about official stories, and neither did German armor, when it cooked off from an internal explosion. The weirdest part wasn't that they'd killed a Panther. The weirdest part was where the shot had landed. That night, they huddled behind a burn-scarred copse of trees, the Sherman's diesel engine finally clicking into silence as it cooled. The sun set late in Russian summers, but by the time Harris climbed out of the turret, the sky was bleeding into deep blue, and the flicker of distant fires dotted the horizon in 360 degrees. Kursk was burning, and it would be burning for weeks. "Hand me that tape, Eddie," Wainwright said, perched half out his hatch with a small metal ruler and a grease pencil. Cole passed him a short roll of measuring tape scrounge from a Soviet mechanics kit. The Red Army liaison, a stocky major named Volkov with a scar across his throat, watched him from a few yards away with a skeptical frown and a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "What is this you do?" Volkov asked in accented English. "You celebrate kill by measuring?" Wainwright snorted. "I celebrate by figuring out why we're not dead," he muttered. Harris was half inside, half outside the turret, leaning on the rim. "Tom thinks the sight's lying to him," he explained to Volkov. "He wants to prove it. Technical manuals are lying," Wainwright corrected. "Sights are telling the truth. Maybe." He pressed the tape measure along the mounting bracket of the gun sight, noting the markings that indicated zero elevation. The British pattern sight had been grafted onto the American 75mm gun when someone in ordnance decided it would give better optics. The problem was nobody had completely sorted whether the calibration marks on the sight bracket actually matched the real ballistic performance of the American gun in Soviet conditions, with Soviet diesel fuel, Soviet ammunition, and the slightly heavier Soviet spec armor plates this Lend-Lease Sherman carried. Back at Benning, they told us, 1 mil at 1,000 meters is 1 meter, Wainwright muttered, mostly to himself. Everything nice and pretty. But this isn't Benning. It's Russia, and somebody screwed up a conversion. Volkov raised an eyebrow. "You were saying your American engineers made mistake?" "Wouldn't be the first time," Cole said. Harris looked between them. "Tom, tell like you told me. Slow." Wainwright sighed, wiped grime off his hands onto an already filthy rag, and pointed at the elevation scale. "Okay, officially, this scale here is matched to a ballistic table they gave us. At 600 meters, we're supposed to be at Mark 6, right? That's what I set us at on the first shot. We hit short and low. Now, Normally, I'd chalk that up to me underestimating range, or the target being hull down, or nerves. But when I corrected, I didn't move it up to 650 or 700 like the table says. I moved the wheel this much. He held his thumb and forefinger apart in a tiny gap, 2 millimeters, maybe 2.5. That is not a unit of range, Volkov said dryly. No, it's a unit of this feels wrong, Wainwright shot back. But watch. From 5 to 6 on this scale is supposed to be 100 meters of range correction. That's about 5 millimeters of wheel travel. I moved at half that. Call it 50 meters. But here's the thing. Our first shot shell impact wasn't 50 meters short. It was more like 25 or 30. Harris nodded slowly. We saw the burst. It was right in front of his hull. Exactly, Wainwright said, warming to his annoyance, which means that when the sight says 600, we're not actually lobbed in for 600. We're low, consistently. My guess? Some genius did a conversion from inches to centimeters, or mils to degrees, and rounded something off. 2 centimeters of barrel angled down at that end. He pointed along the length of the gun. Looks like nothing when you're looking at this mounting bracket. But out there, he waved his hand at the darkness. At 6, 7, 800, 2 centimeters of barrel angle is the difference between bouncing off his glassy and maybe catching that seam under the turret like we did. Volkov stared at him for a moment. You are saying your official firing tables are wrong by 2 centimeters. I'm saying the relationship between what this says and what the gun actually does is off by about that much. Wainwright replied, I've felt it since North Africa. Shots always landing a hair low at mid-ranges. But in the desert, mostly we were fighting Panzer IIIs and IVs. You could still kill those in the front if you hit right. Today, low means dead. We don't get a second miss against that cat. Harris remembered Tunisia. The way their rounds had sometimes smacked into the lower plate of a Panzer, for instead of the turret face he'd called out, the way they'd chalked it up to combat stress, and inexperienced crews because that was more comfortable than saying, maybe the book is wrong. Show me. Volkov flicked his cigarette away and climbed up on the hull. They spent the next 20 minutes doing what would have looked insane to any passerby, using a makeshift plumb line, a steel ruler, some chalk, and too much stubbornness. They compared 0 on the sight to true 0 along the barrel, checking for, of all things, a tiny offset. Harris listened as Wainwright explained in plain words how a slight manufacturing variance, or a misread diagram in some American ordnance office, could have introduced a couple of degrees difference into the neutral line, a couple of degrees which, at 1,000 meters, translated into multiple meters of vertical error. Finally, Volkov sat back on the turret roof and blew air out through his teeth. So, your official data says your gun cannot kill Panther from front at 600 meters, he summarized. Today, you kill Panther from front at 600 meters. Yes, sir, Harris said. And you say this is because sight is lying by 2 centimeters. Wainwright shook his head. Because the book is lying. The sight's honest. The guy who printed the scale, that's a liar. Volkov considered this. In Red Army, we're saying, paper is patient, but ground is not. Your paper men can argue. Ground does not argue. Panther is dead. That is ground's opinion. Then, unexpectedly, he grinned. Tomorrow we test your 2-centimeter heresy, he said. The test range was a stretch of flattened earth on the backside of a low ridge, marked out by rough wooden stakes and splintered Soviet targets, riddled with bullet holes. The Red Army unit to which Harris's crew was attached had been given exactly one captured Panther that still ran. The tank stood at the far end of the field, black crosses painted over with crude red stars. Its engine had long since been removed. Today, it was a sacrificial altar for numbers. Volkov had pulled strings nobody quite understood to get them this. Officially, no one was supposed to waste ammunition proving an American corporal's gut feeling. Unofficially, the Red Army had learned the hard way over 2 years of war that sometimes the crank in the corner was the only one seeing clearly. Range 600 exactly, Volkov said, lowering his field glasses. We are blessed with flat ground. For once. Harris's crew was not alone. 2 other Shermans from their liaison group lined up beside them, along with a Soviet T-34-76, whose gunner watched with unconcealed curiosity. A knot of Soviet officers and British observers stood behind, notebooks ready, the air around them buzzing with low arguments in 3 languages. First volley, standard doctrine. Volkov announced, use official tables. Then we see if Corporal's adjustment makes difference. Just so we're clear, Harris muttered into the intercom. If we prove the book is wrong, some colonel back home is going to hate our guts forever. Colonel back home can come trade places with us anytime, Ortiz replied. Gunner, Panther. 600. Use table, Harris ordered. On. Table says 600, setting 6. Wainwright replied. Up. Cole called. He'd grown quiet since last night, the initial adrenaline replaced by something heavier, a creeping realization that if they hadn't improvised that tiny correction in combat, they'd all be dead. Fire. The round screamed out and slammed into the Panther's upper glacis with a shower of sparks. When the dust cleared, Harris saw a bright silver mark where American steel had kissed German armor and bounced. Ricochet, Wainwright said flatly. To their left, the British crewed Sherman fired. Same result, a solid smack on the glacis, a puff of dust, and no penetration. The T-34S shot went high and wide, the Soviet gunner muttering something vile about his sight's play. Volkov said nothing. His jaw worked as he watched an enlisted man's hypothesis make itself visible. Second volley, he said quietly, use Corporal's correction. Harris exhaled. Gunner, copy. Elevation plus 2 centimeters. Wainwright said. He did not look at the scale as he turned the wheel that tiny, unmarked distance. He was past trusting the numbers. Up. Fire. The second impact hit lower. Not the glacis this time, but square into the narrow band at the base of the Panther's turret. Armor there was thick, but not invincible, and it lacked the extreme slope of the glacis. The AP round punched in with a deeper, heavier sound. When the dust settled, there was a ragged hole smoldering where steel had been. Off to their left, the British gunner's second round did much the same, punching into almost the same seam. The T-34 fired again, and this time found the Panther's lower hull, also at just enough angle to bite. The Soviet officers erupted into low argument, words like ballistics and calibration and deflection punctuated with curses. One British officer furiously scribbled in his notebook, as if he were rewriting a chapter of scripture. Volkov just stared at Whitaker and Wainwright. 2 centimeters, he said softly. 2 centimeters between invincible and dead. Word traveled in unusual ways at Kursk. Radio nets carried coordinates and orders. Runners carried maps and code words. Stories, though. Those traveled on cigarette smoke and field kitchens in the slow, hungry movement of exhausted men huddling in dugouts at night. Within a week, crews in Harris's sector had begun referring to the course correction. Gunners nudged their elevation a hair higher than the book at certain ranges, ignoring the neat increments and trusting the ugly, guttural voice of experience. Nobody could quite agree on a precise number. It wasn't as simple as turning one magic knob. Range, fuel load, ammo type, hull angle, even the state of the tracks all played their part. But the idea that the sight is honest, the table is not spread like an underground pamphlet. Of course, the official story stayed the same. When the Battle of Kursk wound down and the dust settled over fields littered with burnt-out Panzers and T-34S and the occasional American-built hull that wasn't supposed to be there, the reports that went back to London and Washington were neat and clinical. Analyses of German armor performance, tables of kill ratios, recommendations for upgunning future Shermans or replacing them altogether. Nowhere in those reports did it say, at mid-range, the 75's effective performance is being underestimated because the sight mounting scale is off by a tiny, stupid amount. Nowhere did it mention a Panther killed by a Sherman at 600 meters frontally, because officially, no American crew had fought Panthers at Kursk, certainly not in U.S. tanks. Official stories have to be clean. They can't hinge on 2 centimeters of steel and a corporal's stubbornness. Years later, back in a small Michigan town that pretended it had never heard of Kursk, Daniel Harris learned just how thoroughly the story had been scrubbed. It was 1958, and the VFW hulls Paint still smelled new. The war had been over for 13 years. But suburban America was just getting around to building monuments and community centers, as if trying to catch up with the grief it had outsourced overseas. Harris sat at a long folding table under fluorescent lights, a paper cup of bad coffee in front of him. On the wall behind the podium hung a large map of Europe and a smaller one of the Pacific, with red pins marking battles most people had heard of: Normandy, the Bulge, Iwo Jima. No, Kursk. A young man in a crisp suit, fresh out of local college, Harris guessed, was giving a talk. He was a hobbyist historian, one of the new generation, who'd read all the official histories and remember them as gospel. And of course, at Kursk, the main Allied armor contribution was the Soviet T-34, the speaker said. American tank technology of the time, particularly the M4 Sherman with its 75mm gun, was inadequate against German Panthers and Tigers frontally. Studies done after the war show clearly that at 600 meters, the Sherman 75 could not penetrate Panther frontal armor. That's why we developed a 76mm gun and later the Pershing. Harris felt the laugh build in his chest before he could stop it. It came out as a short, sharp bark that made heads turn. The speaker paused, blinked. "Sir?" Something funny. In the second row, a man with snow-white hair and a cane snorted. "Danny, for God's sake, don't start," he muttered. Tom Wainwright, older, thicker around the middle, same eyes. Harris pushed himself to his feet slowly. His knees ached in damp weather now. Kursk had left splinters of shrapnel buried in places surgeons never quite found. "Inadequate," he said, tasting the word. "That what the book says?" The young man shifted uneasily. "Well, yes, Sergeant." "Harris, is it?" The ballistic tables, armor trials, post-war analyses. "Tell you it couldn't be done," Harris finished for him. "Couldn't kill a Panther frontally at 600. That's what they told us in 43. 2. Only, thing is, we didn't get that memo in time." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. Wainwright thumped his cane on the floor. "Tell him about the adjustment, Sarge," he called, "before he writes another book about how we all died, 'cause the numbers said we should." The speaker looked between them, unsure whether he was being challenged or mocked. His cheeks colored. "I'm sure there were, isolated anecdotes." "Son," Harris cut in, "at Kursk, anecdotes came with serial numbers and burned-out hulls attached. You ever seen a Panther cook-off?" The hall went quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car horn beeped. Fluorescent lights hummed. "No, sir," the young man said after a beat. Harris nodded. "Didn't think so." He didn't give the full lecture, not that night. He didn't talk about sight scales or mils per meter, or how a 2-centimeter misalignment in some piece of hardware could trickle down into doctrine that wrote off good men as underperforming because the numbers didn't fit. He didn't talk about Volkov or the test range or the way the Panther had exploded when their second shot found that precise band of armor, the tables said, effectively invulnerable. What he did say, in the plain, gravelly voice of a man who'd survived long enough to see his war turned into clean narratives, was this: the first shell missed by exactly 5 meters, and that was what kept him alive long enough to discover the 2-centimeter lie. The round hit short, plowing into the dark Russian soil just in front of their tank and sending a sheet of dirt across the glassy plate like a dirty wave. It sounded like someone had thrown a bucket of gravel. As steel door, inside the M4A2 Sherman, Sergeant Daniel Harris felt the impact vibrate through the soles of his boots and into his spine. "Panther, 11 o'clock. Range 600, came the shout from the bow gunner, Avi Kaplan, his voice cracking from adrenaline. Harris didn't need the warning. He'd seen the silhouette half a second earlier through his periscope, a low, flat hull, a sharp-angled turret, and that long 75mm L/70 gun that every Allied tanker had learned to fear by silhouette alone. Panthers had a way of dominating the landscape just by existing. They were predators, and everyone knew who the prey was supposed to be. Gunner, traverse left. Panther, hull down in that tree line. Harris barked, his voice steady from habit more than calm. In the gunner's seat, Corporal Tom Wainwright pulled the handles, swinging the turret. His right, I never left the gun sight, a British pattern telescope grafted into an American tank fighting under Soviet command on the Eastern Front. Nothing about this war was supposed to look like this. According to the neat arrows on maps back in London and Washington, American crews were not supposed to be in the middle of the Kursk salient in July of 43, loaned out as an evaluation detachment, in a war nobody officially admitted they were fighting here. But Kursk didn't care about official stories. Kursk cared about who killed who first. On, Wainwright grunted. Up, came the loader's shout from behind him. Private Eddie Cole slam-loaded another 75mm armor-piercing round into the breech and slapped the handle. The gun clunked into battery, a steel promise of either survival or failure. Inside the tank, the air smelled of cordite, sweat diesel, and the faint sourness of fear that no amount of bravado could ever quite wash out. Fire! The Sherman lurched as the gun recoiled. The shots sounded dull and angry inside the armored shell. Wainwright rode the recoil like he'd been trained, letting the sight bounce and then fall back into place. Hit! Harris demanded, short and low. Impacted the berm in front of him. Wainwright said through clenched teeth. Outside, the Panther did not appear impressed. The German tank sat in a shallow, scooped-out firing position at the edge of a tree line, hull mostly hidden, presenting only its heavily sloped upper glacis and turret. A textbook hull-down position. Whoever commanded that tank had done his homework. Harris made the fast mental calculation that every tanker at Kursk had learned the hard way. Sherman 75 versus Panther frontal armor at 600 meters meant they were throwing rocks at a fortress. Officially, according to Allied technical reports, the M4 75mm gun could penetrate around 70 millimeters of armor at that range at a 30-degree angle. The Panther's glacis was 80 millimeters thick and sloped at 55 degrees. On paper, the math said, don't even try. The German round that had hit short told Harris two things. One, they'd been spotted, and two, the Panther gunner's first range estimate had been just a little off. That 5-meter misdistance was the space between we're dead and we get one more chance. They weren't supposed to be here. The Allied Liaison Armor Evaluation Unit existed only as 3 lines in an intelligence file back in London. Officially, Harris and his 5-man crew were in the Middle East, trial-running diesel-powered Shermans for potential deployment. Unofficially, General Montgomery and a handful of American and British planners had decided they needed real data on how the Sherman performed against the newest German tanks, and there was only one place in the summer of 1943 where you could find Panthers in quantity. Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, and the place where, according to every staff officer, Shermans had no business being. Driver, back 20 meters. Use at depression. Harris shouted. Back 20, aye, came the reply from the driver, Private First Class Miguel Ortiz. The tank growled in reverse, treads biting into the churned earth of a Russian wheat field that had been plowed by artillery until it was nothing but craters and churned mud. Ortiz slid them into a shallow dip that gave them a little more hull-down cover. Not much, but right now not much was precious. Gunner, same Panther. Aim up a hair, Harris said. A hair? Wainwright snapped. You want a number? Sarge. We got maybe 10 seconds before he corrects his range and puts one right through our face. Just do it. Loader, AP up. Up. Cole yelled again, ramming another round home. Harris flicked a glance at the range scale by the gunner's sight. It was calibrated in tidy increments, printed in crisp numbers by a factory that assumed war could be reduced to tables. Range 500, 600, 700. Altitude lines to match. The kind of clean logic that made quartermasters and engineers sleep well at night. Official stories said our gun wasn't good enough. Said our tank was outclassed. Said, head on we were dead men. Maybe they were right on paper. But out there on the ground, we found out that if you aimed a little higher than the book said, just a hair, just enough to make your instructors yell at you, you could hit places the tables forgot. A 2-centimeter adjustment. That's all. 2 centimeters between Panther Invincible and Panther Burning. He let that hang in the air. The young historian swallowed. You're saying the data was wrong. I'm saying, Harris replied, that the data wasn't finished. and men died while the paper caught up to what the ground already knew. Afterward, as the crowd drifted away and the maps were taken down, the young man approached him with a notebook in hand. "Sergeant Harris," he said, "if you'd be willing, I'd like to get the details. For the record." Wainwright chuckled. "Careful, kid. Records don't like being told they're wrong by 2 centimeters. Harris met the young man's eyes. He saw something there. Curiosity, yes, but also the first glimmer of doubt. The kind of doubt that might, someday, make for better official stories. "Sure," Harris said. "I'll tell you about Kursk, and about a panther that wasn't supposed to die when it did. But do me a favor." "What's that?" "When you write it down, don't just say anecdotal evidence. Say the ground disagreed with the book, and that sometimes the difference between them is about this much." He held his fingers apart, showing a sliver of air, about 2 centimeters. The young man nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Good," Harris said, "because somewhere, some kid's going to be reading your book when someone tells him this can't be done. And maybe he'll remember there was a time when the official story was wrong, and a little adjustment turned a so-called inferior tank into a Panther-Killer." Wainwright smiled, the same lopsided grin he'd worn in the turret 15 years earlier. "And maybe," he added softly, "that kid will trust his eyes just a bit more than the table, and live because of it." Outside, the suburban night was quiet. No artillery, no burning wheat fields, no distant panthers lurking hull down in tree lines. But for a moment, in the mind of everyone who'd listened, Kursk came back. The smoke, the fear, the impossible shot arcing just a little higher than the book allowed. And somewhere on a forgotten Russian hillside, a rusted panther still sat with a hole punched in the seam under its turret. Silent testimony to the day a 2 centimeter adjustment rewrote what was supposed to be possible.